Haunt is a short-lived comic series that not a lot of people seem to remember. It was made by Todd McFarlane and Robert Kirkman, the creators of Spawn and Invincible. So you would think a story made by them would be pretty well known. Well, there's kind of a reason why it's not. It's because it doesn't come anywhere near the success as their other works. I discovered Haunt when I was younger, but never actually finished it. But I recently went back and read through the whole thing, so I figured I'd share some of my thoughts about it. This isn't going to be an in-depth review of every issue of Haunt because, I'm going to be honest, it's not a complex story. It's not like I'm reviewing Watchmen or anything along those lines, but I'm still going to try to cover the entirety of the story here. This is my first video, but I am planning on covering topics like movies, shows, and video games in the future, and those videos are going to be a lot more in-depth than this one. So if that kind of content interests you, then feel free to stick around. Anyway, let's talk about Haunt. The best way I can describe Haunt visually is if Spawn and Venom just made sweet love one day and had a kid. So he has a pretty cool design, his powers work basically like a symbiote. I guess you could say he's like a supernatural version of Anti-Venom. The other interesting thing about Haunt is that he's a fusion between the two protagonists, Daniel Kilgore and his brother Kurt, who was a soldier that came back from the dead. Huh. Now doesn't that sound familiar? Their dynamic is kind of like Eddie Brock and Venom in those god-awful Sony movies where they're both communicating with each other while they're fused. But these two aren't exactly good people. Daniel's a priest that steals money from his own church to pay for the services of, ladies of the night, if you catch my drift. And Kurt is a special forces soldier that cheats on his own wife with like several different women. His wife being his brother's fiance at one point, so yeah, these guys aren't exactly on the best of terms to say the least. The first main story arc, if you can even call it that, is centered around this journal that Kurt failed to retrieve while on a mission saving this doctor. Kurt ended up shooting this doctor when he learned about his experiments involving human test subjects. Since Kurt didn't have the journal on him, he was taken out by his agency when he couldn't tell them where it was. He was able to come back as a ghost, but he was worried that the agency would come after his wife Amanda, so he goes to Daniel for help. Why is Kurt able to come back as a ghost? It's never really made clear. There's a scene later on when Kurt is told by this Holy Spirit that he's a ghost because some people have a purpose they have to fulfill. So take that how you will, I guess. When mercenaries show up instead of the agency to deal with Amanda, Kurt merges with Daniel and they become Haunt. And I'd be lying if I said that their first transformation wasn't at least a little hype when I first read it. Haunt turns these guys into Swiss cheese, and I gotta hand it to the artwork for the action in these early issues. It still holds up well in my opinion. After this, Kurt leads Daniel to his agency, which is this underground base beneath an abandoned house where these two stoners just chill out at. Since Daniel's the only one that can actually see Kurt at this point, he has to convince the agency about Kurt's existence, and that leads to Haunt becoming an agent for them. Then we get introduced to the comic's first villain, and his name is Herg, and he wants the doctor's journal for his own plans that he has in mind. He's kind of like the Kingpin, where he's this big mob boss who calls the shots and has control over other villains, and he's usually shown in bed with like 5 women at times, so he's quite a chat as well. Herg sometimes fights with Haunt, but it's usually brief because, come on, this guy wouldn't last a second against something like Haunt, and I'm pretty sure the writers knew this. We also get introduced to characters like Cobra, who's this mercenary that works for Herg, and Mirage, who's this one agent that Kurt cheated on his wife with, and they show up pretty frequently in the first half of the comic's run. Herg eventually gets his hands on the journal, but what does he ultimately do with it? He just creates genetically powerful super soldiers. I don't know. The story just made it seem like the journal was gonna build up to something more grand in scale, but the payoff just being a bunch of roided out grunts was pretty underwhelming. And that's how I could describe all of the story arcs, as much as I hate to say it. Soon the people closest to Herg start to betray him, like Cobra, who tries to unalive Herg but fails. It just ends with Herg surrendering to the agency, and he isn't heard of until the very last issue, where he doesn't really do anything worthy of note. You see what I mean about these arcs having pretty underwhelming endings? Yeah, it doesn't get any better than this. The arc after this one is at least somewhat interesting because it starts to introduce more supernatural elements to the story. Which is funny because we haven't had that yet in a story where the main character is half ghost after all. The next antagonist is this thing called the Apparition, and it's after Kurt to pull him back into the afterlife, and it starts to interfere with him and Daniel's missions for the agency. So they get help from this witch lady named Allegria? I don't really know how it's pronounced honestly. But she was introduced early on, but she can actually see supernatural beings like Kurt in the Apparition, whereas before Daniel was the only one who could see them. The Apparition can't be defeated exactly, so Allegria gives a cop-out explanation about how it takes away spirits that lack an aura. Then she gives Kurt her aura so he can't be taken. So the Apparition shows up, he takes Allegria, Haunt is a big sad over it, and that's literally the end of the arc. It's at this point after issue 19 is when the story really starts to go downhill. While it's normal for comics to have new writers as the series goes on, Robert Kirkman and Todd McFarlane leaving Haunt didn't exactly inspire confidence. With the new writing team, the last several issues were almost painful to sit through. Not only does the art style get downgraded, but characters do a complete 180 in how they act, and plot points get introduced that go nowhere and feel completely pointless. Earlier in the series, Kurt is portrayed as someone that while being a hardened killer, he still had a sensitive side to him. He realizes how badly he wronged Daniel and he wants to fix his relationship with him after he's come back to life. But now, it's as if they switched personalities, with Daniel being the one that wants to make things work, and Kurt now suddenly acting like a snarky edgelord out of nowhere. These new writers removed the only decent character development that this series had and threw it out the window for some forced drama. Splendid. Daniel even points out more than once how Kurt has never acted this way before. So they made it sound like there's going to be some big reveal as to why Kurt is so different, but it never comes up. So Kurt's character was ruined for no reason. So in the last few issues, the villain is this insane priest, and he has followers convinced that Haunt is like this evil spirit that needs to be stopped, but honestly, I was so mentally checked out at this point to even care what was going on anymore. This villain was kind of a missed opportunity because he was a priest, like Daniel used to be at the start of the story, so I think something interesting could have been done there. Another character gets introduced pretty late, and his name is Tubman. He's like the dude from The Big Lebowski if he was able to send ghosts back to the afterlife. They tried to make him look bad and give him his own chapter and all that, but it just didn't do anything for me at this point. Yet another villain gets introduced in the last couple issues, and it's this guy who controls insects, but it doesn't feel connected at all to what's even happening this late in the story. It seems pretty clear the new writers had no idea what to do with Haunt, let alone how to give him a satisfying ending. The comic didn't even get its own proper conclusion because it ends with issue 28 and it doesn't wrap anything up story-wise. The last issue just kinda happens. It doesn't feel like a finale, but more like a callback to earlier moments in the story. For my concluding thoughts, I know that this seemed more like a negative review, but I want to make it clear that I wanted to like Haunt going back into it, but there's still things that I do like about the comic. It actually felt like there was some development between Kurt and Daniel's relationship as they merged together more and more and got used to their powers whenever they became Haunt. And I like Haunt as a character. He has a sick design and he can be pretty brutal with his powers when the time calls for it. I'd also like to mention how cool some of the covers are in those first 18 issues. My favorites are probably issue 4, issue 8, and issue 15. Greg Capullo deserves a massive nod for his work on all those covers regardless. In my opinion, I think a character like Haunt could still work today if he was given a new direction. It seems to me that Kirkman and McFarlane had a cool idea with the character, his origin, and his powers, but they just couldn't come up with an interesting story for him. I think the best approach is to either just reboot the comic or, possibly better, make a show that refines the story elements of the comic. Haunt's powers being animated is something I would love to see, especially if it was done by the same team who made Invincible. If you made it this far, which if you did, I appreciate you, let me know what you thought of the video. Since making videos for YouTube is still pretty new to me, feel free to let me know what I can do better so I can improve them going forward. Until next time.